Hi, everybody. Welcome to Mormonish. I'm Rebecca.
And I'm Landon.
And we have a favorite returning guest with us today. We have the amazing Anthony Miller. How are you today?
I'm doing excellent. Thank you for having me this evening.
We love to talk to you. We absolutely love it. And we're going to have you introduce yourself since, you're already very well known. But I will introduce our topic very quickly. It's one word. The word is apostasy. This is going to be good. So we'll let Anthony introduce himself and then we'll dive right in.
Thank you. Some people have seen my Mormon Stories episodes from August of 2019. Some people will have seen my TEDx talk that was released 2 years ago this month. Some people have seen me on your podcast, other podcasts. I have one called Life After Deconstruction, where I've done some episodes, but taken a little bit of a break during the last year. But basically, my story is 8 years ago, as a 49-year-old, I was fully believing, planning to retire and serve missions for the church, about to become an empty nester, and our then 22-year-old son came out to us as gay. And I couldn't metaphorically shelf the implications of that. And so I searched online for resources as to how a believer could support a gay son, not believing that the God that I knew would want him to live a life painfully absent comprehensive connection, love, and relationship. And in my search, I stumbled across the Gospel Topics essays on the church's website. And that led to, it was much less eloquent when it happened, a complete existential identity, faith crisis. And all in one weekend, reading the essays, searching for reviews of the essays to try to understand what they were. I found Mormon Think. I read the footnotes in the essays. I read the cited sources of the essays. I continued to search. I found Mormon Stories, and I found the CS letter over about 3 days with almost no sleep. And here I am, 8 years and 16 days later.
Whew, still alive and kicking.
Yeah.
That's right.
Kind of the anti-Parley Pratt.
That's intense.
It was very acute for sure. Yeah. So I guess it is suitable that we're speaking about apostasy, which the dictionary says is defined as an act of refusing to follow, obey, or recognize a religious faith. Yeah, that happened. Or an abandonment of previous loyalty or a defection. So I would call it deconversion also. So anyway, that's what we're going to talk about today.
It doesn't really define the church's, the church's definition of apostasy, which is, that after Christ, the great apostasy happened. So I guess you could maybe kind of tie those together, but they certainly don't, identify as a great apostasy or in any way recognize that. That's just purely a Mormon thing, the great apostasy.
Yeah, I mean, we'll address this, but within the last couple of years, the Maxwell Institute put out a book with essays and information about first century Christianity. And basically in the book, they explained that there really wasn't this apostasy in the narrative that we were taught growing up in the church. The narrative was not what happened. But today we're going to talk about what Dallin H thinks apostasy is.
Well,
and that's
maybe
important.
He'll clarify it for us.
We only look to the living prophets. That's right.
Well, and we have been told to only look to the living prophets because, like vintage cars and old classic cars and vintage comic books, the words of the prophets don't age. So no, and this is all precipitated upon a document that some people kind of became aware of, talking about Dallin H's definition of apostasy, how you can recognize it. And we've all read it a couple times, and we just thought we need to discuss this. It's very interesting on many different levels.
Yeah, I mean, I will do some speculation, but I want to talk about to try to make sense of what Dallin Oaks is expressing here and what the reasoning and motivation is behind this. And certainly, I think we can speak with confidence that this wasn't a first draft. He didn't just write it, first draft and it was done. I would imagine that many eyes saw this and gave feedback and input before it would be printed and part of a leadership training in the April 2024 General Conference leadership training meeting that at the very least, my understanding included stake presidents and above. And Dallin Oaks presented there, and we're going to look at a slide that he shared or a page from the training that he did.
Wow. So this isn't for the masses or the membership. This is for those in leadership that might encounter someone experiencing apostasy. Interesting.
Oops. Someone from the inside shared what the leaders are talking about. So we'll see what it has to say. So if you want, I'll share it and we can start to go through it.
Yeah, let's do it for sure. I think we teased it enough, right? Everybody wants to know what's in that document. So.
Right.
We always like to know those things the rest of us aren't supposed to know.
Like the handbook used to be. Remember, nobody had the handbook except for leadership. And then suddenly there it was. Boy, that handbook is interesting. Any of these kinds of documents that kind of pull the curtain on what they're thinking. And like you said, Anthony, it's not a first draft. It's not a random writing down in the handbook or this. Every word is so carefully curated. So you can find meaning in every single phrase and word because they've worked on it so carefully, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. All right. So you can see my screen.
Yes.
And so the title of it is General Conference Leadership Meeting. There were multiple pages that I was able to get a hold of, and I'm sworn to secrecy as to how I ended up with them. And this is an instruction from President Dallin H. Oaks. So who wants to read the first paragraph?
I'll read the first paragraph, and it's called Patterns of Personal Apostasy for those that are listening and not watching. So it says apostasy, which is in italics, refers to a person's abandonment of the most fundamental, most basic religious beliefs, such as belief in God or the restoration of priesthood authority. Patterns of personal apostasy include the following, and it looks like there's going to be a list.
Yeah, there'll be a list, but let's talk about that first paragraph. So his definition is it's abandonment of the basic religious beliefs, such as belief in God or the restoration of priesthood authority. So he's what I did as a true believing Mormon, active believing Mormon. I enmeshed the meaning that I attributed to God with the meanings that I attributed to priesthood, as I understood priesthood to have an attribution of meaning as a believing member. And authority of priesthood. So I enmeshed them all together, and that's what he's doing here. Certainly there are some people that lose confidence or belief in priesthood authority or in the restoration narratives and still have a belief in God. Certainly there are people who are active believing members of the church who have done deeper study and learned that restoration attribution of meaning to priesthood really is a modern invention and didn't really exist in biblical times, that there's a fair amount of proof texting and adaptation to get to restoration attribution of meaning to priesthood. But I just thought it was really interesting that he enmeshes this all together, and there's more that he's going to enmesh together. So
yeah, like those are the two main points. Didn't you find that interesting, Landon? It's like you don't believe in God, and even more importantly, you don't believe in the Mormon priesthood.
Well, I think for the church has always taught, and from LDS people, they're kind of one and the same because they've always taught that there's only one true church. So if you lose faith in the restoration and the priesthood, then what does that mean about God? Because you always took this as his church. So if his church isn't true, is he even true? So I think a lot of Mormons, probably more so than any other religion, when they do lose their faith and they leave the church, they become atheists rather than just move to a different church.
Yeah. I mean, my observation, I would say, is pretty nuanced in that the attribution of meaning to God that I held in Mormonism was pretty kind of in the box, like limited. And it was God, the Father, was a resurrected man. Maybe he was the Christ of his own planet or something like that. He had a resurrected body, looked like us, talked like us, but probably in the Adamic language. Lived on another planet with at least Heavenly Mother, if not more. And he had something other than blood flowing through his veins. And the attribution of meaning to Jesus was curated from the lesson manuals and things that I studied and from which I taught. So it would take out parts of attributions of meaning to Jesus selectively, the lesson manuals from the Book of Mormon, from the Doctrine and Covenants, from teachings of past prophets, and from the Bible. Whereas after my faith crisis, and I went and studied biblical scholarship, and I spent more time, for example, in the Gospels attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which we now understand they were anonymously written, later attributed to them, and that they weren't really eyewitness accounts. But in reading the Gospels, there are actually different versions of Jesus expressed in the Gospels. The version of Jesus in Mark is different than the version of Jesus in John, for example. And that's different from the version of Jesus, that shows up in 3rd Nephi, where he's almost bragging about all the cities and peoples that he burned, drowned, and covered with mountains before he went there. And of course, the version of Jesus in DNC 132 is a very different version of Jesus as well. So in any event, what I'm trying to express is I had a very curated attribution of meaning to God and Jesus. So then when I had my faith crisis and I recognized that my spiritual experiences were something other than reliable divine witnesses of truth for me, because they witnessed of partially and entirely false things. And in studying church history, I recognized that it was the same thing was true for the leaders. There were many things about which they bore testimony and had spiritual experiences that are now disavowed by today's brethren. That put me in faith crisis. And of course, then I lost the brittle box that encapsulated the meaning of God collapsed on me. And I lost God in those moments. Now, I think that's pretty common. If you put God in a box, it becomes brittle. And then when it breaks, then the box breaks and there's nothing to replace it with. So anyway, some of my friends post-faith crisis, they have come up with different ways to attribute meaning to God that don't look anything like Mormon God. But I agree with you, the vast majority of the people that I've talked to, when they had a very rigid, defined attribution of meaning to God, once they lost their faith, that never would work for them again.
Yeah, I think Mormonism creates more atheists than any other religion.
Well, I think we do know that. We've talked to Dr. Darrell Ray, who runs Recovery from Religion, an international organization that supports anyone of any faith that has moved aside from that faith. And he says that's very true. Mormons just deconstruct quickly, and then they move to Christianity, and then it's over. I think it's interesting that on the other side of Mormonism, we hear that term Mormon God all the time, where people realize, oh, this God that we've been told to worship is connected to so many of the things in Mormonism that it really is a very specific Mormon God. Where you go to other evangelical Christian churches, there's God that seems like it would be pretty interchangeable with all the other churches in the Christian faith, but Mormon God, that's someone very specific.
Yeah, definitely. One of my favorite stories is from, I heard from one of my friends who went to Richard Rohr's living school. And in a conversation with Richard Rohr, he expressed to the cohort in the living school that he visited India. And when he was visiting India, he asked the people that he was there with, where are all the atheists? And the person or people that he was talking to said, "Oh, we don't have any atheists here unless they were Christian first."
That'll do it every time.
Yeah. And since the attribution of meaning, at least that I experienced in Mormonism, was even more confined and limited, boy, that was even harder for me than just for a regular Christian that had a more mystical or expansive or fluid attribution of meaning to God, for sure.
Yeah, it's a loaded question. This is so interesting.
All right, so let's go to the next one. Is it my turn? No, is it Landon's turn?
Sure. Yeah, I'll read it.
All right.
Focusing on past prophets rather than living, they who garnish the sepulchres of the dead prophets begin now by stoning the living ones. They return to the pronouncements of the dead leaders and interpret them to be incompatible with present programs. That's from Teachings of Spencer W. Kimball, a Dead Prophet.
What? Oh my goodness.
That's 42 years ago that
42 years old, yeah.
Maybe there's a shelf life. Like, 42 up, it's still good.
Under
You
50 years, you can still listen.
Oh my goodness.
Unless, of course, it was Hinckley, and then President Nelson says, no way you can listen to him.
Well, there are those little, pet peeves in there. But I just think, like you said, Anthony, so many eyes must have looked at this. Did no one say, excuse me, there's an irony here. You're quoting a past prophet to talk about not quoting past prophet.
Yeah, you think someone would have caught that.
Exactly.
He's in apostasy himself because he just quoted a dead prophet.
Yeah, well, it's a pattern. It's a pattern, right? So I want to talk about that a little bit. So the moment that my faith collapsed on me was when I was reading the Race and the Priesthood essay, specifically the paragraph that has footnote 9 in it, where the writers of the essay express that Brigham Young prophesied that someday that Blacks would have all the blessings of the priesthood and more. And I had never heard that before. I'm like, what? Brigham Young prophesied of 1978? Like, how come I have never heard that or taught that before? And so I clicked on the link in the site for the footnote number 9, and I went to the cited sources, and there were 2 speeches from 1852 in January and then early February 1852. And the February 1852 speech was one that Brigham Young gave. Not only was he the prophet president of the church, he was the governor of the territory of Utah. And he gave this speech the very day after the legislature passed a law, and he signed it, to make slavery, chattel slavery, Black slavery, slavery of indigenous peoples and so forth, legal in the territory of Utah. And as I read that speech, February 1852, Brigham Young was teaching blood atonement, Adam God doctrine, that Blacks were literal lineal descendants of a literal historical king, that they deserved slavery. It was God ordained and they should be grateful for it, that they should never be leaders ever, that if if there's a mixed race child, that mixed race infant should be immediately killed, and the parents of the child should immediately be killed. And then toward the end of or the latter part of the speech, he taught that basically at the end of the restitution of all things, the way he was describing it indicated he was talking about the end of the millennium after all the other resurrections have happened. He expresses that after all the sons of Abel, which could be all white people or maybe all the white people that would have been born and descendants of Abel if Cain hadn't killed him, after they have all first received the opportunity of the priesthood, then and only then would blacks receive the opportunity of the priesthood and more. And in the speech, he talks about facial features like a wide nose or large lips or something with blacks. And as he expressed it in the speech, it seemed to be like he was saying that at the end of the millennium, after all the resurrections, then blacks would receive the priesthood, the curse would be taken from them. And it seemed like he was saying that they would become white and that their features would change. So what crashed my shelf is I recognized for me in those moments that he didn't have discernment, right? Because that wasn't from God. And for 125 years, as I read the essay, it explained that today's brethren were disavowing all these teachings of past brethren with regard to the reasoning for the ban. And that meant that individually and collectively for over 125 years, they didn't have discernment. They didn't have the ability to discern between their own biases and prejudices and actual inspiration from God. And that was the moment that everything collapsed on me. I think for other people, so what President Oaks is expressing here is my focus on past prophets maybe contributed to my pattern of deconversion or apostasy from the church. And he would be right. That affected it for me. But on the other end of the spectrum, there are people who focus on teachings of past prophets like Adam God, polygamy, other kinds of things that are more on the right-wing conservative theologically end of the spectrum. They're also experiencing apostasy. Anyway, that's what I wanted to share when I read that. I think he wanted to express that that was the issue, but it is ironic that he was quoting a 42-year-old quote.
Well, he's basically saying, if you left the church because you listened to prophets, that's on you.
Yeah, you shouldn't have listened. Even
aren't
though
we
when
taught?
we were listening,
Yeah.
we were told to listen. And I don't know in my past in the church, I have never heard this before growing up. It's only recently that I've heard, do not listen. And I wonder if it has to do with the internet. Think about words of the prophet when we were growing up were very curated. They were in manuals. They were very controlled. Now the words of the prophet are unleashed, right? They're everywhere. The speeches are coming out. The Joseph Smith papers are revealing so much. And so now they're having to say, those guys, nah, not so much. Don't listen.
Remember, was it Relief Society Priesthood where we had the manuals that we studied the lives and the teachings of the
That's
prophets?
what I was thinking of. Yeah, with the picture on the cover and a prophet each time.
But
very
like you
curated.
said, they always have the ... There was always the little ... where they'd remove what they didn't want you to hear that the prophet said. The internet doesn't put the ... in there now, and people can now see it and start saying, oh, that's not quite what he said.
But again, those words that we hung on as children and young adults, teenagers, now we're being told that was nothing. That was bunk. So the next logical step is, well, what about the words today that we're hanging on? What about tomorrow? It really leaves you in this vacuum where nothing is solid. There's no solid ground. And that's not God as having been described to us at all.
It wasn't the God that I understood and believed in. I mean, there's two more things that I would say is how far do you go back? Like, what
Yeah.
about scriptures? What about canonized scriptures? What about when you read the Doctrine and Covenants about how Joseph Smith organized the church, and the First Presidency, the Quorum of the 12, the Quorum of the 70, and the stake high councils were all equal in authority? Like, what about the scriptures?
What about the Joseph Smith papers? We just had a whole project so that we could study what he wrote, but now we're not supposed to believe anything we hear out of it.
Yeah. So I think what he's expressing, and what else is in this that we'll read, I think reinforces my speculation or interpretation. What he's expressing is the pattern of apostasy is to stop believing and following with obedience and loyalty the teachings and the individuals who are the current brethren. That is what he's worried about. So don't pay any attention to the past. Not even the scriptures. Your answers will come if you just follow us.
I take it one step further. I think he's saying he knows there's problems in what the past prophets said and that they did not have discernment.
Yep.
And he's trying to lead you away from even going there and only following them because he knows there's problems in the past. And he can see what so many of us who has seen that lack, we have the integrity to say, we're done. We're not buying into this. Whereas he wants to keep promoting the church and the narrative, even though the narrative is wrong and he knows it's wrong.
Right. And listen to us now, which is very hard to justify when he's saying, don't listen to us yesterday. But again, I think we have to remember that this is training for leaders. So, and this is probably something that most bishops will hear when someone comes in. The first thing they'll say is, well, this doesn't match, they'll bring up the words of the past prophets, but this tracks completely with what they're saying are now considered trusted sources. And that is words of living prophets, the handbook, of course, which is put together by current standards, current leaders, church magazines, again, very immediate, very current sources. And then they also say the scriptures, but they really focus on the other ones. Everything right now, like a goldfish, 3 seconds. What was said 3 seconds ago? That's what you need to believe and follow right there. Don't look any farther.
Right. In most wards, I think the curriculum is to rehash the most recent conference talks, right?
Yep.
As opposed to spend time like in the Gospels, or the writings attributed to Paul or whatever. Yeah. And like you said, Rebecca, and I don't think that this is insignificant enough that it bears repeating, is that the implications of this is that future leaders can easily and summarily disavow and teach differently than today's leaders. And we really can't have any confidence that there won't be major changes. So it seems the interpretation of that is that Jesus isn't leading the church in a very specific, precise way if the teachings of his leaders can be so fluid and change and contradict over time.
Well, and I've heard, for example, when you go through the temple, they've changed things. So the covenants that I made when I got married are very different than the ones that a girl today would make. They no longer have to covenant to obey their husband. And as people try to work their way around that, huge problem, I think, I've heard people say, well, you took the oaths or made the covenants or heard the words in your day that you were supposed to hear for you, right? It's different for another person 40 years later. But again, like you said, where's that God is unchanging, everlasting? I mean, if time to God is a wink of an eye, he's literally saying one thing and then saying the next. I mean, there's no continuity. And I think it's very problematic if you really drill down.
Well, we also get a doctrine that's immediate to the church's needs at that point, not necessarily an eternal truth. This is where we get steeples over peoples. Where they're now teaching, that love your neighbor isn't as important as build the steeple tall. And they can put that in a book They can put that in a magazine and say, that's the way it is. This is doctrine now. And people are just supposed to jump on board. But when you go back through the scriptures, none of that checks out scripturally.
No.
But by leading you to their magazines and to their conference talks, as opposed to the scriptures, they can tell you to believe whatever it is they want you to believe at that moment.
Right. Or letters from the stake, like we saw in the McKinney, Texas temple. They need it to be high, a legal workaround. We have to make sure that's part of our doctrine. So they send out an email. Make sure when you're defending the right to build a temple, you say the height is the most important thing about the temple. No LDS person had ever heard that prior to these letters. And yet we saw city council meetings just the other day where grown men were crying over the height of the steeple. It had only been a month or so since they were told that that was the most important thing. And they're going to defend it, and they're going to tear up when they're talking about the light and the height of the steeple. So that's how quickly it can become the most important thing to you when it's an immediate need that the church tells you, you better feel in your burning of your bosom, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So President Oaks here knows that there's a growing exponential apostasy, loss of belief, deconversion, shift of loyalty and commitment. And so this is how he's identifying these patterns. And absolutely on this one, there are people who are losing faith and experiencing a loss of confidence in the brethren because they believe that what was in the temple before was from God. And now that it's changed, they're like, oh, they're just making it up as they go, but they still believe the prior thing. There are people that have experiences like me that I lost trust and belief that they really had any divine appointment or anything. Kind of there's a spectrum of people experiencing deconversion, being exposed to past prophets and seeing the changes that are happening today.
Agreed.
All right, so I'll read the next one. It feels like we're in like a Priesthood Relief Society meeting.
Kind of beat that one
I'd
like
like
a
to
dead
read.
prophet, didn't we?
Yeah,
You know what,
right.
though? I never volunteered to read ever when I was in Sunday School or Relief Society. And now everything I read is so fascinating. I'm like, ooh, I'll read it.
Yeah.
I don't know what
making
that
up
says
for
about
it.
me.
Yeah. All right. So the next paragraph says, so this is patterns of personal apostasy. The next paragraph says, contending that current religious leaders are not in harmony with the latest discoveries of science or other scholarship or political correctness. There's a lot to talk about in that.
There's
one.
Because
I would say, agree,
that's true.
agree.
It's true on all
I am an apostate.
Yeah. So when I think of latest discoveries of science, I think of Greg Prince's presentation that he gave at University of Utah several years ago about the genetic and epigenetic and other factors that contribute to a higher probability that somebody will be LGBTQ, for example, where in the past, people like Elder Packer, claimed that a just God would never make anyone gay. The church has shifted over time. They've had to, although not all of the members have gone along with the change. Now, my understanding is if you go to the church's website and find things that have to do with individuals who are gay or have gender dysphoria, they'll express, we don't know how or why, but they've stopped the narrative that it's a choice, for example. And that's an example that I think of when I think of science. Can you think of examples of science?
I can think of every example of science. You look at the archaeology, where they continue to contend that the Book of Mormon happened everywhere in all places. You just have to look at the latest Book of Mormon Central, where they went everywhere and everything testifies of the Book of Mormon. And yet the church knows there hasn't been a single, they had farms, they had to cancel it, that went out looking for the Nephites and the Lamanites, and they had to, it's been completely debunked that any of this happened, and yet they refuse to believe it. DNA, look at the DNA with the Lamanites. They completely, you look at the essay on DNA and they give you all these bottleneck and that you can't believe it and that it can disappear. And they try to give you all this current science when the current science from all areas say that they came from Asia, not from, that they weren't Semitic people. You look at the linguistics, which clearly show where that these languages evolved over 12, 15,000 years, and yet they claim that they were a Semitic people writing in Hebrew. Completely untrue, completely scientific debunk. Look at the horse bone that they found, and they're claiming that horses existed. You type on the internet, did horses exist in the Americas? And BYU comes up everywhere. The first 30, they've completely tried to overshadow what every archaeologist, everyone who studies pre-Columbus America, there were no horses, and yet they want to try to make that clear. 6,000-year-old Earth, we still hear that taught. Yeah. Evolution, I think we just heard President Nelson say, "I can't believe we came from monkeys." Yeah. That's not even new science. That's 200-year-old science that has been completely accepted by everyone, is even taught at BYU now, but yet you still hear about it in the in the church leaders. So I mean, if you name a scientific field, and the church will try to cast doubt on it because science clearly debunks the Book of Mormon and the narrative that the church has. Every field of science, when you look at it together, just blows it out of the water. So the church has to question it and try to make you believe that they don't really know what they're talking about, when in fact, it's clear what the evidence is.
So the Garden of Eden wasn't in North America, like it says.
We don't want to burst your bubble, Anthony, but no, I have a great example of
flood. Yeah, there's another one.
And this is Landon and I. We visited the Bean Museum at BYU, right? So it's Brigham Young University's museum, and it has all kinds of exhibits there, and it does have exhibits that show ancient bones and ancient skulls and things like that. It has signs all over that say the church has no official policy on evolution. They're not going to tell you. But what's interesting, we've visited many different museums that show the trajectory of the evolution of man. And usually the museum will set it up, all the time, where they show chronologically how it happens. Here's a skull, and look, it's slightly different. Now look, you can so clearly see it. At BYU, they pepper all the bones and the skulls in amongst each other, so you can't detect a pattern. Oh, here's something from 10,000. Wait, here's something from 10. Yeah. Here's your brain does not go there. They're trying not to make it clear. As you see in other museums, look, step by step, man evolved. And then I read this next word. It says science or scholarship.
Yes, let's talk about that.
Isn't that great? We have a great example in Mormonish about scholarship. It's kind of an ongoing scenario where we had someone who had a background in Egyptology reach out to us, talking about, this person was a professor, talking about a student who had come to this professor wanting to do a project on this group that he found that believed that this papyri was written by Moses. They couldn't, of course, they're talking about the book of Abraham. Neither of them had heard of that. And they couldn't believe that there was actually a group of people that believed that what was written, in this picture on this papyri was Moses. So again, here's this scholarship. A not even graduate level student in college can recognize that papyri has nothing to do with what it said. And it's so intriguing to him that he wants to do a project on it and show how, utterly nonsensical that is. But in our faith, many, many believe that's accurate. Yet it seems like everyone else, not in that silo, understands that's not accurate.
Yeah, so a couple of things when I think of scholarship. The essays wouldn't exist if it weren't for critical historical scholarship in the study of Mormonism and Mormon history that grew, and people like Richard Bushman and Terrell Givens and others, of course, Mike Quinn and others. So there was
Leonard
critical
Arrington,
historical scholarship being
Leonard
done.
Arrington,
Yeah. And that debunked the polished faithful narratives. And on his interview with Mormon Stories, biblical scholar Dr. Dan McCullen suggested that as there has been waves of deconversion as members have been exposed to non-polished narratives about church history, his opinion is as public access to biblical scholarship becomes more prevalent and easier to understand, that he believes that will bring about the next wave of deconversion. And so biblical scholars will tell you that the King James Version of the Bible is very problematic and not the best translation. And they'll explain things like how the Pentateuch, the 5 books attributed to Moses, came to be and over what period of time, which is a huge problem for just about everything in Mormonism, because Mormonism relies on the stories in the Pentateuch, in the 5 books attributed to Moses, being literally historical to a particular degree, at least Abraham and Moses and the tribes of Israel part. But still, the story of Noah, the book of Abraham is dependent on a global flood where Noah's 600-year-old man who built an ark and put animals in it, his granddaughter, Egyptus, discovers the land we now call Egypt after the global floodwaters recede, right? So as people get exposed to biblical scholarship and they realize that Paul didn't write all the letters that were attributed to him, and that the book of Revelation was not ever intended to be a direct prophecy about our day, or even that the writings attributed to Isaiah, those written by him and those written in his name later during and after the exile, were never, ever intended to be direct prophecies about Jesus. A lot of people are, I think, and I agree with Dan McCullen, that will be the next wave of deconversion as that becomes more accessible, that kind of scholarship.
That's what took me out the Old Testament, actually, when I started studying that. I mean, there were many things that took me out, but that one was definitely one of them. And you didn't even hit Adam, because if Adam's not a real person, there's no need for even an atonement, because the whole reason for the atonement was because of the fall of Adam. And if Adam never fell, there's no need for Jesus. So that brings into question, did Jesus even exist if Adam didn't exist, at least as a savior, because there would be no need for a savior if there wasn't a fall from Adam. So yeah, it causes a lot of problems if it's not historical.
Yeah.
I think that's why they're having less and less reading of the scriptures. As I understand it, in seminary, instead of reading scriptures, they, reading through these scriptures, they choose specific scriptures to memorize and to read. And then it says you work with your seminary teacher or your leaders to come up with other scriptures that you want to focus on. But it sounds to me that they're not like what we used to do, just reading the passages, reading through. It's like you said, very problematic now today with new scholarship. My favorite one now is political correctness, because I'd like to say,
let's talk about
does that mean being on the wrong side of every issue throughout history? I guess that's political correctness. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I mean, my comments about political correctness are, they know that the membership is very divided politically, not only in the US, but around the world. And so there are active believing members who experience faith crisis because the church pays for vaccines, and because they did social or physical distancing during COVID, and President Nelson and all of the Quorum of the 15 got a vaccine, and he did a video about it. And they encouraged or required mask wearing in the temples and stuff like that. There are people on one end of the spectrum that are losing their faith, patterns of personal apostasy, as President Oaks is referring to them, from the right wing. And then on the other side, there are people in terms of what he's maybe referring to with political correctness. There are people that recognized what the impact of the church fighting the Equal Rights Amendment did for people, or other kinds of things that are difficult, across the spectrum of political belief. And so there's deconversion happening because of what he's calling political correctness, but because they're trying to be politically neutral with a membership that is not politically neutral.
Yeah, and I agree 100% with what Rebecca just said, and that is they've been on the wrong side of every issue almost from the beginning. You look at, they were on the wrong side on polygamy. They were on the wrong side with blacks in the priesthood. They're on the wrong side with ERA. They're on the wrong side with LGBTQ. And even when you talk about COVID, they waited till pretty much everyone else had already made a decision and said, this is the way we're going, before they said anything. They didn't stand up right at the beginning and they waited to see. And that seems to be the way that the church is operating now, is they sit back, they wait until a winner is decided, and then they have a prophetic revelation after the issue's already been decided by the culture, so that they fall on the right side of it, because they've traditionally always been on the wrong side. And I see things like what we're uncovering right now, how they're meddling in politics and how they're out there stirring, just like the zoning laws that we're seeing, where they're going in and they're getting the zoning laws changed when nobody knows about it. And they're damaging communities, and we see the result of the communities they're damaging with these temples right now. Right. That is politically, that's a form of political correctness. They're upsetting the neighbors. They're putting their members at this position where they're having to defend is really just a stupid decision. Put it where it's zoned, and you're not going to have all this hatred. But because you're, shoehorning it into somebody's neighborhood and forcing it upon them, and then they get upset about that, and then you say that they're bigots, and the church is out there actually trying to push that narrative, as we've seen in some of the writings from it, where they say, oh, it's not just anti-Mormon bigotry that does this. It has nothing to do with bigotry. It's you putting it where it doesn't belong. So we see over and over that they're making political decisions that are not popular, and that the members are then asked to support, and the members are saying, we don't support the LGBTQ. A lot of members are going, I can't support that. My conscience does not allow me to support your position on that. Yep. It doesn't allow me to support your position on where you're putting the temple. And members are starting to rebel from that and say, I'm making better political decisions than our prophets are. Why am I listening to them?
Yeah, I would suggest a new hymn. Who's on the wrong side? Who? Right? Is that no? I think, but culture, where are you? We need to write this. So, in terms of political correctness, it reminds me of another talk at conference, Neil A. Anderson, and his talk on integrity, which I podcasted about with 21st Century Saints. And most of us think as integrity, like you said, Landon, a moral compass. I don't feel right about this, even if the prophet's saying it or your leaders, it doesn't sit right. Well, the new definition of his integrity is to do what God tells you through the church leaders. And they say in the talk that you might find yourself on the other side of political correctness. You might find yourself at odds with current stances, say on LGBTQ issues or something. But if you have personal integrity, you will follow what the leaders are saying, and therefore you're following God. So it's just a very twisted, warped land of bizarro, but they like you said, Landon, they know that the members are struggling, and they have to find a way to make this where they sense it's not politically correct. It doesn't feel good to me. They have to say, nope, that's your integrity. Despite all this other feeling, you're following the leader and following God. So it's kind of diabolical, actually.
So I'm going to push back a little bit, and I'm going to share 2 examples of things that they got right.
Good. I'm glad you are. Thank you.
Okay. So the first one is they did push for women to have the right to vote, right?
They
It
did
was,
so they
it-
could become a state. It
it
had a
was so they could
politically
become a state.
motivated.
But so the reasoning was very self-serving, but at
Yes.
least
Yes, that's what I was going to say. That
they
was a
did do that.
self-serving function,
Yeah.
which I don't think counts.
No, and
Yeah.
after they got statehood, they no longer encouraged the women to be politically active at all. They
Right.
told them to do it then, and then just sort of,
Yeah.
it's okay. But you're right. They did do it, whatever their motivation.
Yeah.
So we'll give 1 point. Half
Okay,
a-
second point, and actually this one is I think important actually, is they have been pro-immigrant and refugee
This is
to
true.
the extent that they've alienated a lot of their conservative members.
Yep.
But they will baptize, give callings, and temple recommends to undocumented immigrants and refugees. And so I'm going to give them points for that one because I think that is the right thing to do. I mean, Jesus was a refugee, in the story. So
I would push back a little on that. Again, I agree with you that it's the right thing. And when we read the New Testament, it's very pro immigrant or somebody who's not part of the. However, again, I think it's a self-serving thing because they want looser ability to move in and out of countries for their own mission programs and to bring people who have converted to their faith and have them come and be strengthened in Zion without having to wait for years and years. So again, it's a little self-serving, but I think you can look at it both ways there.
yeah, I can see how you'd come to that conclusion. I can see that.
But the bottom line is a good thing. The bottom line are those things happen. So,
It is good that they're pro-refugee and pro.
They are pro-family. That's a pretty good thing. I'll give them a point for that.
For sure. Yeah.
3 points.
Yeah. 3 points. Yeah.
All
right.
On to the
So
next one.
yeah, next one. Proposing.
Let's see. I think it's my turn to read. And I picture these leaders who were in this meeting then, kind of having this in their desk, and someone like Landon comes and sits in front of them and they kind of go, yes, he's doing that. And you're an apostate. It's just
patterns of apostasy. Yeah.
That's right. So the next one on the list of patterns of personal apostasy that a leader might be on the lookout for if someone comes to speak to them is proposing one's own special learning or position as a substitute for prophetic leadership. Now, that's very difficult because we all know what our special learning is. We've studied and we've learned, and we can't unlearn it and we can't unsee it. So that's a difficult one.
Yeah, I think what he's suggesting there is when active believing members have learning, scholarship, and experience, and they're willing to push back. So I think of the Givens book called All Things New that eviscerates traditional atonement theology and the perfectionism and the harm that comes out of traditional atonement theology. I think of that where that is probably threatening to the brethren, where there are people pushing the envelope but not crossing the line about different theological issues that the brethren aren't ready to talk about. Certainly, this could go back to things like scholarship or biblical scholarship. It could have to do with people that understand mental health, counseling, things like Natasha Helfer's experience being excommunicated because of what she had talked about sexuality and a number of different things, and then openly criticized the brethren for not doing the right thing. So I think the brethren feel threatened when people who have specialties, advanced learning, and other kinds of things, and they feel like they're getting ahead, they're being gotten ahead of. And I wonder how they feel about people like Papa Osler and his Listen, Learn, and Love podcast. He's doing amazing work for someone who's on the inside, but I imagine that And some of the things that happen at Faith Matters Foundation is making some of the brethren, maybe President Oaks, uncomfortable. That's what I'm reading into this one right here.
Oh, no, I think you read it exactly right. And I thought it's interesting where it says your own special learning, that's not a substitute for prophetic. It doesn't say prophetic learning. It says leadership. So it doesn't necessarily imply that the leaders know more than you or have studied more than you, but they are your leaders. You need to respect their leadership despite your scholarship. So that's very important. You have to put that all on hold and just follow the council and respect their leadership. So that's very different. But that sounds like you, Landon, when you went in to talk to your.
Well, I look at this more as kind of what Anthony just said, you know, that people who have a profession in something do know more than the prophetic leadership about a subject. That's what they've made their life career to be. And yet the leadership does not want them to speak out on it. As you talked about, you know, masturbation being perfectly normal. Every child counselor is going to tell you that that's perfectly normal behavior. And yet the prophetic leadership tells you, no, it's not. And the one thing I notice, though, is they never take their own careers and say that they're not an expert in anything. How many times do we hear that President Nelson is a heart surgeon? Now, would he take advice from a prophetic leadership on how to do heart surgery over his learning in medical school? He would never do that if he was doing surgery. Likewise, you have all of these lawyers who are not going to take their legal advice from the church educator who became the president of the church. They would lose their cases if that's what they did. None of them in their professional lives took prophetic leadership over what their profession was. Why are they asking those who are just standard members to ignore everything that they learn in their profession and just listen to whatever the prophetic leadership says, even when they know it's wrong what they're saying? You have a duty when you're a trained professional and somebody tells a group or you individually that something is not what it is. You have a right, you have a duty, a professional duty to say that's not correct. And here's how we know that, and to share that information with people.
But that's a pattern of apostasy, according to President
Yes,
Oaks.
it is.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right, Landon, are you next?
Sure. Persisting in teaching subjects on which the Lord has not chosen to give more revelation at this time.
Comment, Rebecca?
To be just about everything.
Well, to me, that's a new phrase. I'm hearing that more and more. The Lord has not chosen, meaning it's not us. You know, if we had our way, of course we'd do this and this and this. But no, we're waiting on the Lord. The first time I heard that mentioned was in reference to the lifting of the priesthood ban at a celebration called the B1 celebration at the conference center. And they had all kinds of, you know, all of the Q15 were there, and Oaks himself got up and he basically said, I'm sorry, guys, you know, it was not great. It sucked, but we were waiting for the Lord to choose to allow all of you. I mean, Gladys Knight was there, allow all of you to, you know, partake in the blessings of the priesthood. And there was like an audible, you know, they almost couldn't believe it. It definitely passes the buck. It's not us. It's the Lord choosing, for whatever reason, to withhold whatever it is that we're curious about, mother in heaven or women in the priesthood or women's roles, or, you know, any of the things that we wish we had more direction in from our prophetic leadership. It's not them. It's God has decided not to reveal it yet.
What happened to the restoration when we were growing up? It was like all things have been restored. The God,
Exactly.
you know, the questions of the ages have been answered. And now there's so many questions, so many problems, and they know that, and they can't provide an answer. So they just say, well, the Lord's chosen not to reveal that to us at this time, because they can't answer the questions. That's why this has come up.
And again, I'll suggest another song rewrite. Heavenly Father, are you really there? Right? Are you really even there? Are you even directing anything that's happening? I mean, I have a lot of parody songs to write. Call me.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly that when I think of people who have experienced deconversion, I think of things like church history and biblical scholarship and science and reason, but I also think of social cultural issues that relate to this particular sentence
For sure.
in the pattern in terms of the role of women, the voice of women, the patriarchy, LGBTQ issues, the kinds of dynamics that happen if you're a single parent in a ward or lower socioeconomic class, because we still have prosperity gospel narratives and things like that. People experience deconversion over those kinds of things. And I think this sentence hints at some of that in terms of deconversion.
Well, he did give us a revelation on how to treat the children of married LGBTQ people.
Yes.
And then he changed that revelation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very good point, Landon.
Yeah,
That's
President Nelson, I mean, God changed his mind
Yes.
about that one. Yeah.
So God cares about certain things, just not other things that are huge pressing issues to those of us mere mortals.
Yeah.
Yes. And right
So
now he's choosing to reveal how important steeples are on temples as opposed to, important things like LGBTQ and how are those people supposed to live within the gospel confines and find fulfillment and happiness.
Yeah, because President Nelson likes temples with tall steeples, not like the Mesa, Arizona temple or.
Yeah, the other 11 that don't have steeples, or like the Hong Kong temple where they took a steeple off in the remodel. Those are anomalies. I feel those will be corrected soon with the new doctrine.
Maybe with a new prophet, God will change his mind about the design of temples.
Yeah. Well, you're right. Once there's a new prophet, we can pretty much file away what the old prophet has said.
Yeah. All right. So the comment that I have then is what I perceive is that the leaders of the church, meaning the quorum of the 15, they really have ingrained to them that the highest moral values in their priority of moral values includes loyalty and obedience to those brethren that have seniority. And then other values, honesty, integrity, transparency, and so forth, other moral values are subservient to obedience and loyalty. And so my sense is, speculating, reading into this, President Oaks realizes that these are different patterns that lead to deconversion or a loss of loyalty. And in his mind, I think he believes that loyalty and obedience to the current leaders with the most seniority, which he's number 2 in line, that is what is most important. And apostasy represents not holding obedience and loyalty as your highest moral values. Am I imputing too much to this?
No, I think you're reading that exactly right. And we had a guest on a while ago who was not on Mormonish, who was not LDS, and he was just kind of from a fly on the wall studying Mormonism. And he came on and talked about some observations. And he said, you are a church of edicts, meaning whatever your current leadership says, whatever edict, that is what you're following right there to the letter. It doesn't matter where it came from, historical precedents, what it means. It's right now. And then as soon as there's someone else, another edict. And that's it. We're just going from edict to edict, flip-flopping. There's no moral compass of your own. You're just waiting to be told, oh, I love the steeple. Let me cry about it. That's the flavor of the day. So that was a really interesting observation to me, that it's a difficult way to live your life because you never know what's going to happen next, that you're going to have to wrestle with, get on board with, and then like the November 15th policy 3 years later, say, oh, okay, now I believe that isn't what was supposed to happen. It's very difficult for a moral person with a conscience.
Yeah, there these patterns of apostasy. I think we're seeing people on the inside of activity and nuanced belief and on the outside that are manifesting all of these.
Yep.
And it seems to me like maybe it's too much to say desperation, but I think there's an unsettling experience that they're having with the degree to which this is happening. It feels like it's not in their control anymore. The growth of the church is essentially zero. I mean, if they were really reporting numbers like, instead of reporting 17 million that include a lot of dead people and people who never considered themselves fully members of the church, if they were just reporting endowed members with a current temple recommend, I think those numbers are contracting. And that's why there's this huge emphasis on temples and other kinds of things, because they see what's happening with that statistic, the endowed with a current temple recommend statistic.
I'm looking at this, and if I look at that left side in that column, I'm noticing something here. He starts out by defining apostasy, and he says that apostasy is the abandonment of your most fundamental beliefs, such as belief in God or belief in the priesthood being restored. Then look at the next four things he says. The four things are that you're not following the living prophet, that you don't think that the religious leaders or prophets are in harmony with latest discoveries. You think that the prophetic leadership or the apostles' leadership is not where it needs to be, that it's being overwhelmed, and persisting in teaching subjects that the Lord hasn't told to his prophet. Every single one of those it has nothing to do with God. It doesn't say you stop loving your neighbor, you stop being charitable to others, you stop charitable giving. Those aren't signs of apostasy. The only sign of apostasy, according to President Oaks, is you're not listening to us anymore. And since I'm the senior apostle, you're not listening to me anymore, is basically what he's saying is apostasy.
That is so interesting because, again, Neil A. Anderson's talk, you have to love God by following the prophet. That's it. God is the prophet. And that's how you manifest it right there.
Yeah. And the scriptures, we go right back to the scriptures. You know, the first and great commandment is love God. And how do we show that? By love our neighbor, not love the prophet, not follow the prophet. That's not what he said. The second great commandment was not follow the prophet. The second great commandment was love your neighbor.
Yep. They've reworked that, though. And this talk, I'm telling you, everyone go read it. The Integrity Talk by Neil A. Anderson. I think it was Saturday morning. And he said sometimes in following the first commandment, meaning loving God through following the prophet, is going to put you at odds with the second commandment, meaning loving your LGBTQ neighbor. So, and again, I'll say this, RFM says it all the time. You don't get it. You follow the first commandment by how you enact the second commandment. By loving people is how you follow God, but not in the new definition. Following the prophet, as you pointed out in the leadership Landon in that list, that is how you love God. So it's really tricky.
Yeah, the first commandment in their perception is to love them and to be obedient and loyal to them, because there's not space between them and God, right?
They are God.
Yeah.
They are. Now we have to rewrite the hymns. We have to rewrite the scripture. This is, boy, we're changing everything here.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see what's in the new hymnal.
Oh my goodness. Won't that be telling? I predict right now, lots of songs about the covenant path, which I think the rhyming word will have to be hath, maybe bath, if they're talking about baptism. They're going to say covenant path a lot, and ongoing restoration, I'm guessing.
Yeah. I mean, they probably believe that if people follow the covenants, they'll be obedient and loyal to them. Right.
Yeah. I think that's it.
I mean, the covenants include to not evil speaking of the Lord's anointed, them, to dedicate all your time, talents, and efforts and everything which you have or may have to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which they are the mouthpieces or oracles for. It is all about them. I think. I mean, in their mind, I think they believe that if you follow them, you're following Jesus, right?
Yeah, they're told
but there are these patterns of apostasy where people are coming to a different conclusion.
I think so too. I just realized that you could really easily rework Onward Christian Soldiers to ongoing restoration. I'm going to work on that one too.
Yeah. Yeah. We need those musical
We do.
things
Because
because
those are the things that, according to post-Mormons, and I'll agree, the things that stick in your head the longest, the things that you cannot get out are those
Yeah.
primary songs that just
Yeah.
come back to you just like that. And the primary songs are where you learn the core foundational doctrines. It's where you learn all these things. Follow the prophet, all of them. They're all there.
one of my friends had a very cathartic experience when she was in her faith transition. She took her patriarchal blessing and rewrote it, kind of like you're rewriting hymns.
Interesting. Yeah.
And that was very cathartic to her to edit and rewrite her own patriarchal blessing.
That is fascinating.
All right. So in the second column, I'm just going to read the first sentence, and then I'm going to skip to 2 other slides and talk about it before we come back to the 2 bullet points. And the first sentence in this training on the second side of this paper is, what do we do to help persons with patterns of apostasy? All right. So let me share this right here. You should see LDS Personal Faith Crisis. So you can find this on my unpackingambiguity.com website. If you Google search it, there are other places that you can find it. Basically, the church was experiencing a lot of deconversion in the early 2000 to 2010. And John Dallin and others, Greg Prince, Travis Stratford and others, put together this personal faith crisis report to help the church understand what was happening. And this report was prepared specifically for Elder Marlon Jensen, who was the Quorum of the 12 or Quorum of the 70 member, who was the church historian at the time, to present this to then President Uchtdorf. And he presented this to President Uchtdorf in 2013, and it includes this personal faith crisis report that's 67 pages long, plus a supplement that included chronicles of individual stories of people that have lost their faith. And if you'll remember, in 2013, that's when the gospel topics essays started coming out. And there's crossover of many of the findings of this LDS Personal Faith Crisis report that correspond with many of the topics that are in the gospel topics essays. And then you'll also remember that in October of 2013, then President Uchtdorf gave the talk that I believe was the reason why he was let go from the first presidency when President Monson died. Because in that talk, Come Join With Us, that's the one where he says, doubt your doubts. But he also expresses that there are many people who struggle with a very long time as with regard to their activity in the church. And it's not necessarily because they're lazy or wanted to sin or never had a testimony in the first place. And so he also said in that talk that there are things in our history that are not in accordance with our values today, or that's something like that is what he expressed. So this is what was happening in 2013, and this report was given. So I'm not going to go through that because listeners and viewers can search for it and read it. Maybe you could share a link in the notes.
Oh yeah, no, we'd love to share a link, because I don't think this is looked at enough. I mean, the timeliness of it, all the things that sort of happened in hindsight, you can look and you can see the impact this had, yet it wasn't widely circulated. People didn't know about it, but it really, I think, made things clear about us apostates and what was really happening.
Yeah. I mean, when you read it, it clarifies that it's not for wide distribution. It was specifically for the brethren. But I think out of frustration, eventually, Travis Stratford, Greg Prince, and others agreed to have it released to be public after that. So the next thing that I'm sharing with the viewers, the slide says project background. This is a presentation on faith crisis that was given at BYU, Hawaii. that used some of the materials from the LDS Faith Crisis Report, and also included additional data and information. I'm going to go through some of the slides pretty quickly and point a few things out. So in addition to, on this slide, it says research methodology. They did interviews and strategic guidance on 20 plus different subject matter experts or with experts. They did in-depth interviews between 2011 and 2013 with 40 members who were active, less active, believing, doubting, and non-believing. Then they refer to a survey from 2011, which is the one that John Dallin was involved in, that included 3,388 doubting, non-believing members. They also did qualitative narratives and solicited information from more than 1,500 doubting and non-believing members that were collected in 2013. So this wouldn't have been part of that LDS Faith Crisis Report. It was subsequent to that. And then there was 18 months of review and refinement by LDS subject matter experts and presentations to senior leaders. And that's what came about for this presentation at BYUY. So there are 5 key learnings from this. The first learning is many doubters and unbelievers are active. And so a little bit less than half of the people surveyed still attended church in some fashion. 56% didn't attend, but 20% still attended weekly after losing literal belief, 6% every other week, 5% monthly, and then 6% quarterly, 6% annually. So what they were expressing here is in your congregation, whether it's weekly or every other week or monthly, you have non-believing people who have gone through a faith crisis in your congregation.
And that I think really speaks to family dynamics, mixed faith, children. There's so many reasons that somebody would still be attending, even if they completely have lost their belief. They don't have their belief. There are many other pressures, influences that would have you attending.
Well, it's their friends, their community.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So the slide number 2, it states disbelief typically is not shared with leaders. And then I'll read the bullet points.
Not everybody's Landon,
right,
who openly shared his disbelief with any leader that would listen.
And I did too. Like within a week and a half after my faith crisis, I met with my bishop to ask to be released as ward mission leader. And I asked for a calling for a faithful non-believer. And when he asked me, like, well, what are some of the things in the essays that gave you a problem? Because he hadn't read them, he knew they existed. I thought, well, I'll share something innocuous. Did you know, I asked, that the 1890 and 1904 manifestos were essentially a lie, that that there were post-1890 sealings, including President Woodruff, and that in the 1904 manifesto totally lied about what they knew happened in terms of post-manifesto marriages. And my bishop told me, oh, of course I know that. I'm a descendant of one of those, And I'm like, what? How did I know? But he didn't have the capacity to answer my questions.
Right.
So, and it sounds like Landon had a similar experience. So the bullet points under this is with regard to disbelief is typically not shared with leaders. It says spouses tend to be aware of the faith crisis. They tend to be, not always. I know a lot of people that experience faith crisis and they waited to tell their spouse because either they felt like their spouse would divorce them or lose trust in them, or a lot of people who I've talked to thought that they would actually find satisfying answers. Mm-hmm. So when they finally went to their wife or their husband, they could say, I found this huge mess, but I found the answer and here it is. Yeah. But by the time, all that time has gone by, then they finally tell their spouse, then their spouse feels betrayed because like, if you've been hiding this from me for months and years, like, how can I even trust you anymore? It's a tough thing. But spouses
the sad part about that is that's actually belief, because you're saying I'm finding all this stuff that is causing me all of this mentally, I've got this dissonance, yet you're saying, but I know it's true, therefore I'm going to keep digging because I know I'll find an answer because it's true. And so you're actually exercising extreme faith and extreme belief that you're going to find something. And then it's only after you completely exhaust yourself where you finally say, this is not true. It's
I couldn't
simply
find an
not
answer.
true.
Yeah,
Yeah.
couldn't find it.
All right. So the next bullet point is church leaders and friends tend to be less aware. So people tend to hide it. The next bullet point is church typically is not viewed as a safe place to share doubts and concerns. I'd comment, I've seen that because I created and co-lead a local Mormon spectrum group here in Billings, Montana, similar to a Thrive group. And about 20% of the people in our group are active, nuanced members of the church, nuanced believing. And many of them have told us in the group, because we don't approach things with an agenda of where individual faith journeys will end, we'll support you where you're at. A lot of the people in our group who are active, nuanced believing tell us that the only way they can be active is because they have us, because it's not safe for them to talk about the things that they talk about in our group at church or with their believing friends and family. When our local leaders, really understood that we help many people stay in the church who want to stay in the church, while they, really can't ever suggest that someone would participate in our group because we don't have an agenda for a faithful reconciliation of things. I think they realize that we are doing some good too, trying to help people not blow up their lives, supporting them in their grief, supporting people in mixed faith relationships, and even supporting people who ours is the only safe place where they can have difficult conversations. So anyway, thanks for letting me share that. So the next bullet point is believing members often ascribe insensitive labels for member unbelief, like sin, desire to sin, being offended, hard-heartedness, lack of adequate study, low intellect, stuff like that. So in any event, this is a training to leaders of studies that have been done at BYU Hawaii of the dynamic.
And I think this must have been before some of the terms that have been bandied about, lazy learner, lax disciple, taffy puller. I mean, there's definitely a whole list of things that are used against people that simply are working through it, have doubts.
Yeah, I don't remember if this was presented in 2015, 2014, 2016, something like that.
These are all in the 20s, like 21, 22. So I have a family member.
That sounds like a stripper name.
It could be. It could. You find your stripper name by your first pet and then the street you grew up on.
Oh.
So mine is Taffy Catskill. Just in case anybody's wondering. But no, I'll add to that. I have a family member that sort of jokingly, but maybe not jokingly, refers to me as a tare, as in the wheat and the tares. I'm a tare. So there's definitely a way that you other people with your language, backed up by scripture. It's really an interesting phenomenon to not have to deal with a person and their actual thoughts and feelings and what they might be finding. You just simply label them, and then you can be kind of at peace yourself, I think.
Yeah, so it's a belief affirmation for the believer, but it doesn't make it a safe place for the person.
It makes you feel really bad. Yeah.
All right, so the next slide indicates that from their study, faith crisis members are largely educated, more educated, and largely higher earners, which, are they concerned about tithing? I mean, maybe they keep track of tithing, but in any event, it's interesting that what they found. So I'll share some of the things. So of the people in their study, 10%, 1 in 10 had a doctorate degree. 21% had master's degrees. 39% were college graduates. 27% had some college. And of people that were just high school graduates and no higher education, it was only 3% of the sample. And essentially 0% that didn't finish high school. So I think what they found is people in faith crisis know how to study and research and apply critical thinking. And then on the income side, only 10% earn less than $20,000 a year. This was probably 8 years ago, right? 14% between 20 and 40,000, 17% between 40 and 60, but more than half make more than 80,000 a year. And in fact, 36%, 36 plus 42% make more than 80,000 a year, 42% of the people who lost their faith. So certainly that's a lot of tithing money, but it's indicative of the demographic that's going through faith crisis.
So it looks to me like the way to make more money is not to pay your tithing, it's to lose your faith.
Ah, I like that.
Yeah, I didn't used to believe that, but all right. So number 4, to debunk the common narratives that people weren't in far enough or didn't fully believe. Number 4 slide reads, even members in leadership roles were included. 21% of the respondents of their, what was it, 1,888 in the survey, 21% were in bishopric or their spouse was in a bishopric or higher callings. And that included 136 people who were stake auxiliary or high council members. It included mission presidency members, bishopric and stake presidency members. In their demographic, a very unusually large percentage were people who were in ward or stake council level callings, either because they were in auxiliary leadership or whatnot. So when you think of that from the brethren's standpoint, if your faith crisis is happening with people in the ward who aren't making the ward happen, that's less risky compared to when it's your stake and ward council and auxiliary leader members that are the ones that are higher educated, higher income, and they're the ones experiencing faith crisis.
And I think they're aware of this because we hear the phrase, they recognize best and brightest. And I also think if you look at the way they've reorganized wards and the structure and the number of people at higher levels that you need to have, they've cut down on that. I think they've recognized that those people are not there. Wards can now operate with almost, I would say, a skeleton crew of the faithful that are remaining. So I think they're aware and they're trying to adjust and hope that no one else notices.
Yeah, but it's not slowing down.
Yeah, exactly.
Problem is, once you see how the sausage is made, it's hard to have the appetite. So
and I would also suggest I've learned this from anecdotal experience, but I think there are enough people that I've talked to believe that this is absolutely the case, that when members encounter difficult information or they're dealing with difficult issues, social cultural issues or whatever, and they do have the faith to go to their leaders, and the leaders try to put in the work to answer the questions, so they read the essays themselves, that's what's contributing to a higher percentage of deconversion among local leaders than you would otherwise think, because they're trying to do their job, their responsibility and stewardship to help people that actually come to them, even though most everyone in their ward who's going through this isn't going to them.
I think that's why they changed the Council of Love. Well, first they changed the name from, court to Council of Love. And it used to be how many people would be in there with the stake presidency and all the high councils, like 18 people sitting there listening to someone rehearse their doubts and the things that they learned in their scholarship. Now it's just 3 people, right? I firmly believe that's why they do not want these people in faith crisis, highly educated, armed with data and information, in front of multiple leaders.
Yeah, if they listen to Bill Reel's church disciplinary council before it was called a membership council, if they listened to that, they were probably horrified that he shared what he did with all of those high council members, including high council members were saying, well, he's not lying, you know, kind of thing. It
takes one.
So I wonder whether Bill Reel's recording of that contributed to the choice to not have the high council automatically attend.
I think so. I think you're absolutely right. Because I think a lot of people feel on the faithful side, what everyone is talking about or what you would say in a court are, you know, anti-Mormon rhetoric or slurs or slams. That's not what it is. It's information. It's often off the church's own website. I made a Trexmo. I do these little Star Trek memes for post-Mormons. And one of them's looking at a computer screen and he says, these are anti-Mormon lies. And the other one says, this is literally the church website. So I think there's a miscommunication. That is not what post-Mormons are talking about. It's the actual doctrine. It's, you know, off the church website itself. So that's dangerous when you have leadership going on. I didn't know that. And then perhaps looking further. And I'll also say we have, talking about studying, trying to help, we have friends whose son contacted them from a mission and said, Mom and Dad, I'm having trouble. I don't think I believe anymore. I'm reading the New Testament. It doesn't line up. And they're like, oh, son, we're going to help you. And they start reading and studying and pulling together all the materials they possibly can to help their missionary. You can imagine what happened. They're all out now, simply through wanting to help, turning to church sources and studying.
Yeah. So it was Dallin Oaks that said research is not the answer.
Yeah.
All right. So number 5 slide, and then we'll go back to the more recent training. Number 5 slide says the primary drivers of LDS's faith crisis. Number 1, internet-based access to uncorrelated information. Google is what they say. And I would add to that Wikipedia, even the church's website, right?
Well, this is where the billions of dollars are going, SEO. It gets worse and worse every day. If you Google some church-related something, you're going to go through 30. You're just going to have to sift through it until you come to something that is not, here's the key, uncorrelated.
Yeah. Well, that's number 2 of this section. It says constant availability of uncorrelated information via mobile devices.
Wow. I have not seen this one before because Landon will back this up. I said, it's not the internet that did this and broke it open. It's the smartphone, because you're sitting in gospel doctrine. You're like, I didn't know that. Let me just, oh my God. You know, it's right there. You used to have to hear
Google
something,
book of
go
Abraham.
home. And look it up and whatever. You have immediate, what? I've always said it's not necessarily the internet. It's the smartphone that did it.
Yeah. And this presentation was made before TikTok existed.
Oh dear.
And Exmo TikTok, I would think they would put that here. You know, if it hadn't been done this research like 10 years ago about. So number 3 says member exposure to uncorrelated information via traditional and social media. So Facebook, Twitter, stuff like that. And I would add YouTube.
Yeah, and Landon accidentally puts that kind of stuff on your Facebook page, don't you, Landon?
Accidentally, yes, I do.
Accidentally, whenever he tries to post something over to Instagram for Mormonish, and we're always very careful to stay in our silo. We don't want to upset friends and family. It accidentally cross-posts to his homepage. So it's family like, what are you doing, Landon?
What are you doing? Yeah. sharing uncorrelated information.
Yeah,
exactly. So that was number 3, exposure to information on via traditional and social media. And then number 4 is the ability to discuss and debate alternate points of view with like-minded people on social media. So someone preparing a lesson about the Book of Abraham finds the Wikipedia page on the Book of Abraham, and then they end up watching the Robert Rittner interviews on Mormon Stories, you know, or the Book of Abraham documentary video that was done years ago before that. And they want to talk with somebody about it. And now it's easier to talk with people about it because of social media. And so those are 4. It says there were 5 drivers.
Yeah, and you can speak to that one, Landon, because when you stepped away 5-6 years ago, there was even that recently, there was not very much in place like there is now.
Yeah, you couldn't find anything. And when I'd go to like the church websites trying to get answers and find people I could, discuss something with. And I wanted somebody faithful to discuss it with, and they'd make you log in and send the question in, and then they'd review it, and you couldn't have an actual discussion. And when I started saying, why am I not allowed to just have a discussion on the post-Mormon stuff? I can have a discussion and people will answer back. They'll give me their sources, but on the faithful site, crickets. They had to study it. They never would give you an answer straight up. And you had to submit the question before it would ever show up online, and then they'd review it and put it up with a faithful answer next to it.
They had to correlate it, Landon. That's what it was. Yep. It takes a long time to do that correlation.
Yeah. So I'm not going to go further in this one, but I think this is helpful for context that the brethren know, because they received the faith crisis report, and certainly they would have been aware of this training at BYU Hawaii, where they did additional research and confirmed information that was in the faith crisis report. And what those studies have revealed is research isn't the answer, because either people don't find satisfying questions or answers to their questions, or there's not a way to put God back in the same box, or if there's a loss of trust in the brethren, there's not a way to all of a sudden go to have the same level of trust that you had before, when you recognize that they prioritized protecting faith and heritage and moral values of loyalty and obedience as higher values than honesty, integrity, and transparency. There's not a way to all of a sudden put the genie back in the bottle, right? So they recognize that. So I think when we read the balance of this training from April from President Oaks, I'm hoping that the listener and viewer can appreciate why I chose to refer to that BYU presentation as well as the faith crisis.
Wouldn't doing a BYU study on faith crisis be a form of apostasy, because it proposes that the BYU professors have special learning or position that is higher than the prophetic leadership?
I think it'd be fine as long as they don't tell anyone about it.
Yeah.
Which is what happens when they have findings in a study that do not align with the prophetic leadership. Then they have to kind of put the kibosh on the study. That happens all the time.
And then the study gets leaked.
Yeah. And then the study gets leaked. That's a whole nother episode, isn't it? Oh my goodness.
Yeah. Like this slide that we're back to, Patterns of Personal Apostasy by President Dallin Oaks, or from President Dallin Oaks. So he states, what do we do to help persons with patterns of apostasy is a question. The first bullet point is, he says, the wisest course may be not to contest a person's objections to church activities or doctrine or personnel. The only and ultimate treatment for those who are in or seriously headed towards apostasy is to increase their faith in Jesus Christ.
Well, that explains it. When you go in, they don't address what you're asking. They simply tell you to read your scriptures more, or, delve more into the church. That explains it.
Have more personal experiences, attend the temple, renew your temper, recommend.
Remember your mission. Yeah.
Don't pay attention to these other things. If you feel the Spirit, attribute meaning to that means that you're where you're supposed to be, and God wants you to do, what we're telling you to do.
I'm going to hold mine until we read the next one.
Uh-oh. You can tell Landon's head is turning red. He's going to.
All right. So the training, again, this is training to like stake presidents and higher. The wisest course is don't contest their objections or questions. And and only focus on increasing their faith in Jesus Christ, which on the left side of this, we identified that faith in Jesus Christ, and Rebecca, you identified that with the talk about integrity.
Mm-hmm.
They've redefined meanings of faith in Jesus Christ and integrity to mean that you trust and follow and are obedient and loyal to the brethren. That's what that means. Increased faith in Jesus Christ to them means increased faith in the brethren. That's how I'm reading it. So the second bullet point is, if a person's apostasy or tendency towards apostasy is based on a highly focused and difficult challenge, there will be a tendency to try to take it head on. But we do not know enough about the will of the Lord and the fullness of the church doctrine to satisfy. We don't have satisfying answers. We don't know enough, is what he's saying. And then continuing, he says, an attempt to persuade with additional reasons does not help. He's saying that traditional apologetics don't work. Isn't he saying that? Anyway, I'll read the balance, and then Landon can release his rage.
Better hurry.
President Oaks says, there is no answer but faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, faith in the restoration of the gospel, and patience in waiting for answers when the Lord chooses to reveal them. So let it out. What do you got, Landon?
Well, I can't help but look at the right side and compare it to the left side.
Mm-hmm.
The left side was all about listen to us, obey us, follow us, turn to us. How do you keep what do you do to help person who is in apostasy? Nowhere in here does it say listen to the brethren, follow the brethren, do what the brethren says. It's like, oh, listen to Jesus, or Jesus didn't give the answers. It's Jesus's fault. Jesus is the one who's going to help you, not the brethren. So follow us on the one side. But when you fall into apostasy, don't turn to us for answers. You got to go to Jesus, because we don't have them.
They don't know enough. It says right there, we do not know enough. Follow us to a T, but we don't know enough about what the Lord wants you to do, but still just follow us, because we're just spitballing here. Please follow us. Yeah, it's very disheartening when you talk to leaders, if you still do believe while you're, in the middle of a crisis, and you come up against all of these tactics and methods. It really makes you leave scratching your head going, there really is something wrong here,
And they specifically don't say go. They say don't go to your church. They say don't talk to them. Don't talk to this person who's having a faith crisis. They're not saying go to the church leaders when you have a faith crisis, because they don't want you coming to them when they have a faith crisis. Go say your prayers and pray to Jesus. And when you don't get an answer, it's on Jesus, not on us, because we're infallible.
Well, it's feelings. That's really the only reason. Feelings are the only thing that are going to allow you to put these questions behind you and not even think about them anymore. There's no answer. You just have to use your faith and your feelings to put those aside and not worry about them anymore, and trust, I think, is what the answer is.
Right. So I think it connects to the BYU Hawaii study, where a larger percentage of the people that have experienced faith crisis, a large percentage are leaders. A large percentage are more educated and higher income. And if you're talking to stake presidency and higher levels, there's going to be a propensity for a higher percentage of them to be more educated, higher income, right? So I shared the other to express how I view what they're saying here. Is they're trying to tell these leaders, don't try to do this stuff. Don't try to be an apologist. Being an apologist doesn't work. There aren't good answers. You're not going to be able to give a good answer on LGBTQ issues. You're not going to be able to give an answer on patriarchy. You're not going to be able to give an answer on how the church handles financial transparency and SEC fines. You're not going to be able to give a satisfying answer on how the church handles circumstances of abuse, sexual and other kinds of abuse, ecclesiastical abuse, physical abuse, spiritual abuse. You're not going to be able to give satisfying answers. And I think they know that if those leaders try to find and give satisfying answers, they risk losing those leaders, because that's what the BYU presentation refers to, studies that indicate that that is a risk. And so I think, like Landon indicated, that the right side corresponds with the left side, in that in their mind, apostasy is not being obedient and loyal to the leaders, and they're equating faith in Jesus to faith in them, but they're also training the leaders to not try to be apologists. And I think it's because they know that they're losing leaders who try to do that. That's my take. What do you?
No,
I
think you're right. And it so clearly says we do not know enough about the will of the Lord and the fullness of church doctrine to satisfy. So, and I just had this funny observation as you're talking about the best and the brightest and the most educated that leave. Almost every time we podcast with somebody else, in their background are books, shelves of books, or degrees on a wall, or it's just so funny. And they're not there to say, look at me. They're there because that's who they are. I mean, if you ever seen the Backyard Professor podcast, he's up there grabbing books off his shelf. We've got books. You've got books. I mean, it is the people that like to study and to learn and to dig in. And again, best and brightest. And we are willing, I think, to talk to people. Like Landon said, if you don't find answers because your leaders have been told not to answer questions all the time on Post-Mormon Reddit, you'll have somebody come in that says, I'm active, but I have this question, or I'm nuanced, I'm wondering. And when you read the answers for the most part are respectful, knowledgeable, full of sources. People are bound to be impressed with that, right? Where all they get somewhere else is, well, just feel it. It's okay. Don't worry about that. Well, that doesn't cut it anymore.
Yeah, I don't spend a whole lot of time on Reddit, but the last time I was on Reddit was within the last month, and there was a guy in the R Mormon Reddit group explaining that he was in faith crisis, like he was in the dark night of the soul. He was searching for answers. He's trying to make things work, and he shared that he went to ex-Mormon Reddit, and people were trying to give him answers that would help him soften things, or maybe even figure out how to work it out and stay in the church. And he also asked questions in a faithful Reddit, as I recall, maybe the Latter-day Saint Reddit. And the response that he got was totally shutting him down, being disrespectful, calling him names, stuff like that.
Or banned. I'm banned. I was banned within 30 seconds of saying something on the Faithful site that was very innocuous. It was nothing.
Yep. So it's an interesting problem they have. My guess is that about 3% a year of otherwise active believing members are losing literal belief. It could be more, but on a compounded basis, that's like a third of the church, right? In 10 years, half of the church, possibly in 15 years. And I think the brethren see that happening. I think that they see declining endowed with the current temple recommend numbers. I'm sure it's less than 1 million. It's probably less than 800,000.
Yeah, that's kind of the stat I've heard about, 800,000. Yeah.
And they're seeing low retention of younger members, and those who do stay tend to get married later and have fewer children. So just from a demographic standpoint, the implications for the church 20, 30 years into the future is wherever in the world there's easy access to uncorrelated information, and where the local members are not getting a disproportionate benefit for their participation that's positive, the church is collapsing over time, and it's not growing. So certainly, I grew up in the church in a broken family. My father had a difficult time providing for us. We were the family that wouldn't have had a Christmas if it weren't for the members of our ward. And when my parents divorced, I had father figures, I had home teachers that were faithful, all the things like, of course, someone who has that kind of experience in the church is going to remain faithful in the church because so much of their experience is a net positive, and they're going to avoid uncorrelated information that causes dissonance, that threatens that. But when you get people that are more independent, more critically thinking, that are contributing more than they're receiving back, I think that is where the problem is. And I think they're very concerned about it. And so the covenant path and build a bunch of temples that they can't fully staff because there aren't enough members, and President Oaks doing this presentation about personal apostasy. I think those are the results. That's my take.
That's a great take. What do you think, Landon?
I just, as I was thinking as we were talking here about President Uchtdorf's, doubt your doubts, as he talked about that. And, in what aspect of your life do you do that? He was an airline captain, for heaven's sakes. If you say, the altimeter is showing that I'm in a nosedive right now, that can't be right. You don't just say, yeah, I doubt that's right, and crash to your death. You look at the airspeed indicator, you look at the horizontal, the artificial horizon, see if you're in a nose down position. You're confirming the doubt. Am I in a nosedive? But you don't do that with your doubts in the church. The church should certainly be encouraging you that if you have doubts, confirm those doubts. Confirm whether they're true or whether they're false. If the church is true, like they say it is, they have nothing to fear. But they doubt that you can find the truth, and that's why they give you these recommendations that you follow them and that you don't do the research, because they know for sure that if you try to confirm your doubts, you will end up in apostasy.
Are you saying they doubt themselves?
They doubt themselves. They doubt their message.
Themselves.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. And we always talk about, Landon, the other areas of your life, like you said, where you wouldn't doubt. For example, if your daughter brought home a boyfriend and she said, I don't know, I have my doubts. I mean, he didn't graduate from high school and he seems like he has a really temper. You don't ever go, doubt those doubts. Just doubt them. Go ahead. And in the world of finance, right? This is your realm. You don't ever go, there's this fund. Oh, I've heard horrible things about it. I think it's run by con men. I don't know. I'm just not sure. Doubt those doubts and don't even look into it. Just put your money in it.
Invest in everything. Yeah.
Yeah. So my take on what he's expressing with doubt your doubts and where that resonates with some believers is maybe they've studied some things and they know some of the problems, and they've studied some apologetics that seem like there could be some plausibility. And at least some of the believing friends that I've talked to, they think it could go either way, like it's a 50-50 thing, where we would say, yeah, there wasn't a global flood and there wasn't a 600-year-old man named Noah who lived in North America before he put animals on an ark and sailed to the Middle East so his granddaughter could discover Egypt, right? That didn't happen. That was Joseph Smith, who held a fundamentalist, literalist view of the Bible, expressing things through his paradigm that the Bible was literal history, right? But there are other things where they think, well, it could have been messy. We don't know everything. History is like a foreign land. There's some apologetics. There's chiasms and Hebraisms in the Book of Mormon. Yeah, there's problems, about this thing, but they try to express, at least the ones that I've talked to that are believers who know some of the problems. Many of them are like, you can choose faith because it's like 50-50. And then the believers who I know who are more nuanced, who realize it isn't 50-50, they've kind of developed, I think, their own version of Mormonism.
For sure.
That works for them, and they use it as a vehicle. But it doesn't look anything like what is coming from President Oaks. Anyway, that's what I think doubt your doubts means, is just trust us. every time I say that, I hear Elder Ballard's voice when he says I know I've studied this from the beginning of time due to the integrity of the brethren. There's never, ever been any attempt to hide or suppress difficult information. Just trust us. So anyway, that's what I think about that.
Yeah, that works on a certain number of people, don't you think?
On 17 million, according
on
to them.
17 million, according to the stats. That's right.
Yeah.
Well, I
Or
think
maybe about 4.2 million.
Yeah.
no, that's it.
Doubt your membership numbers.
Doubt your membership numbers. That's right. But trust in the number of temples you see announced and eventually built. Although that number seems to have a lot of variance there, the ones that are announced and the ones that are actually built.
So yeah. And there's growth in units, even though we've gone to 2-hour church so we can fit more units per building. And we've reduced what is needed for a size of a unit that in the past would have been a branch, not a ward.
Yeah.
So
well, I'm glad that however you got a copy of this, that you got it, because
thanks.
I think it's really important to go through and to understand what the mindset there is, either for ourselves or for family members that might be in faith crisis that we're trying to help. And it's just interesting to kind of take the pulse of the upper leadership when it comes to what do they think is happening? Are they aware of why? What do they think of us? I think we can learn from that. So what would either of you hope any kind of takeaways from making this information available would be? And then I think we'll close after that.
I mean, I think it just gives insight into, I perceive that this gives insight into what they're thinking that then contributes to the kinds of messaging they do, the choices they make, the policies they pass, the general conference talks that they give. They're dealing with this. They see it's an existential problem. They see that, in 15 years, they could lose half of their current active believing members. And the majority of them will be the local leadership, the higher educated, the higher income, and that's going to hurt not only tithing, but how do you run a ward if you have a higher percentage of faith crisis among your ward and state council leaders than you do among the members of the ward that aren't? You'll promote. I mean, this sounds insensitive, but you'll use what you can, right? Because you still have to have leadership. But as you advance them into leadership, then you're going to expose them to more problems, which puts them at more risk. So they have problems. It's clear that they know there are problems. They've known for over a decade that there are problems. And I think this just gives insight to how they're dealing with it. So, I mean, I think it helps us maybe hold grace for some of the leaders that receive this kind of training and act that way, because they really believe that having faith in Jesus Christ means being loyal and obedient to to President Oaks. But realize in the end, it's a problem, and they know it's a problem, and they know that apologetics. I mean, when I first read through this, I'm like, holy crap, they are acknowledging that apologetics don't work, right? And they're acknowledging that they don't have satisfying answers. Like, that's a pretty big reveal. Yeah, I mean, it's like if I have a friend come to me who's active in the church and finds meaning to it in the church, and they say something like, it doesn't really matter to me whether the church is true or not. It wouldn't change my experience in the church if the church wasn't true. Like, you would think that they're probably saying they know it's not true when they say that.
We all know people like that. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Anyway. And then it just speaks to what you value and what you're getting. I had a relative say to me just the other day, you just need to go back. You need the friendship, the camaraderie, you need the support. You just need to go back. Just do it. And I'm like, you can't explain. You can't. You just can't in that way that person, and you would never get out of it what that person thinks that you'd be able to get out of it. You just couldn't. So at least certain people couldn't.
That reminds me of a Brene Brown quote or expression. Brene Brown shared that the opposite of belonging is fitting in.
That's it.
Because belonging is where you can show up as your full self.
Mm-hmm.
If you're in a faith crisis, it's safe to talk about it. If you're a single mom in a ward where you're the only single mom, it's hard to fit in.
Yeah.
And you can't fully belong if what you're trying to do is fit in. And I think a lot of people believe that they belong because they fit in. But what maybe they don't realize is that to the extent of what's happening in the post-Mormon community, or even in organizations like Faith Matters, is there are places where people can go and belong without having to fit in.
Yeah. What do you think, Landon?
It just makes me proud to be an apostate. It means I'm a critical thinker who doesn't just follow blindly whatever somebody says to me, is kind of the way I took that, their definition, by all means, I'm an apostate.
An abandonment of previous loyalty or an act of refusing to follow, obey, or recognize a religious faith.
Yeah. Proudly
Guilty as
apostate. Yeah, you're like guilty. That's great. And I will say, you, Landon, trying to create a space for others, just exactly like what Anthony was saying, through podcasting or just being there to talk to people, or, you're trying to help form community on the other side of it. So apostates just aren't selfish. They're not independent. They really are trying to be there and help and band together and form community. So
we want apostates to belong, not to just fit in.
Yeah. Apostates are some of the best people I know, for sure.
I love it. This is great. Yeah, I think I'm going to title this episode, Are You an Apostate? Right? Because we're not using that as a bad word. It's thrown around as a bad word. But when it just talks about that you have a new paradigm and you've changed your loyalties, you still have loyalties. And that's to yourself. That's to your personal creed. That's to others. That's to family. You are still loyal. You've just shifted from a paradigm that you maybe found some information and you can't be there anymore. So it's okay. We apostates are not scary. And that's the bottom line. So, well, this has been an amazing conversation. And we really came up with this just very quickly. Anthony had shared this information with me and Landon and some other podcasters and said, hey, here. And I'm like, this has got to be a podcast. This is going to be amazing. And we just appreciate you, Anthony, for putting this all together and especially bringing in that former survey and that information. And we'll have you give us any links to anything that you shared that you'd like to put in the show notes so that everybody else can look through things. Because I think definitely they'll want to drill down a little more on some of this. So
for sure. I'll share the Faith Crisis Report, the Chronicle stories, and the BYU presentation with you.
Perfect. This is awesome. Well, I hope you guys all enjoyed this. I certainly learned a lot and was very honored to be able to podcast with the wonderful Anthony Miller again here and with Landon, of course. Thank you. Please, in the comments, let us know what you think. Are you an apostate? It's okay. Raise your hand proudly and say, yes, I am. Please like and subscribe to Mormonish Podcast. And if you'd like to help financially support the podcast, there are always links in our show notes to Venmo, PayPal, and mormonishpodcast.org. And we really appreciate those of you that do. We just honestly, we're not kidding when we say we can't do it without help. So we really appreciate all of you. Thanks so much. We also have a link to our merch store. I think, Landon, you have one of our merch mugs there. I'm in my other studio, so I don't, but we have mugs and hats, and everybody keeps asking, didn't Landon design a bikini? Yes, he did. And we're still working to make it appropriate. And then we're going to put it out on the merch store. You don't want to know what it looks like now, Landon. So anyway, we have a lot of fun here at Mormonish, and we love our fun guests like Anthony. And so we'll say thanks again, everybody. We will see you next time. Bye-bye, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Mormonish. We really appreciate our listeners and would love to hear from you if you have a story you'd like to share. You can email us at mormonishpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and on our website, mormonishpodcast.org. And don't forget to look for us on YouTube and like and subscribe. Keep joyful, everybody.